morning. How's everyone doing? Well, you're really in for a special treat this morning because we have kicking the day off with the fantastic George Harbison. George P. Harbison is a writer, speaker, political activist, and retired chief financial officer. In 2016, at the request of a YAP student leader, Mr. Harbison created and delivered a lecture titled The Victims of Socialism at the University of California, Irvine. Since then, he has delivered this lecture at over 20 college campuses and at several student conferences put on by Young America's Foundation here in Santa Barbara and in Reston, Virginia. Mr. Harbison's lecture focuses on the death and destruction caused by three socialist regimes in the 20th century: Russia, China, and Cambodia. The presentation consists of narrative, pictures, music, and graphics that put into perspective the staggering death toll, pain, and suffering inflicted on citizens of these regimes. The lecture touches on the worldwide death toll of socialism and brings forward to current times the ongoing threat of this destructive ideology. As a result of his work on this topic, Mr. Harbison has been named to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation Speakers Bureau. He has also written extensively on tax policy, focusing on dispelling false tax assertions. In 2013, he wrote an article for Forbes.com that completely debunked Warren Buffett's famous and politically charged assertion that his federal tax was only half that paid by his lower-paid office workers. Since then, his tax myth-busting articles have appeared in Forbes.com, RealClearMarkets.com, Real Clear Politics, and The American Thinker. A native of Michigan, Mr. Harbison received his BA from Kenyon College, where he majored in physics. He continued his education at the University of Michigan, where he received an MBA, emphasis in finance and accounting. Mr. Harbison resides in Mullet Lake, Michigan, and is a diehard Michigan Wolverines fan. Please join me in welcoming George Harbison.
Good morning, everybody. First, I want to thank YAF for asking me to speak at this important conference. I'd also like to thank my fellow speakers who I know were inspiring to you yesterday. I hope I can do as well as they did. They're a tough act to follow, but we have a few of them here to listen in today. This will be the 27th time that I've delivered this lecture, and every time I deliver it, I get angry. I get angry because of the terrible and unfathomable human toll socialism has taken on innocent people throughout the world over the past 100 years. I get angry because, unlike natural disasters, the suffering and misery brought on by socialism are entirely the result of human design and intention. I get angry because this hideous ideology continues to be embraced and promoted by many Americans, particularly in academia. And I get angry that this awful ideology is not adequately taught in our schools. The rise of socialism as a perceived viable ideology in the United States over the past several years should be of grave concern to all Americans. Sadly, it is not. While many conservatives have warned of the dire consequences of socialism, they have not done a good job of conveying the sordid history upon which their fear of socialism is informed. This incontrovertible history will be the focus of this lecture. Before diving into this history, I'm going to spend the first few minutes describing what socialism is, and, just as importantly, what it is not. Then I'll tell you the horrific and tragic story of the victims of socialism. The last part of the lecture will deal with socialism within today's political landscape. It is a timely topic. I'll get the discussion started with a brief recap of the basic tenets of socialism. In Marxist theory, socialism is a transitional phase between the overthrow of capitalism, which is freedom, and the realization of communism, which is a class-free, state-free utopia. Socialism, as the ideological agent of this transition, relies on a totalitarian, authoritative state to actualize forced economic equality, the elimination of private property, total state control of the means of production, the de-emphasis of the family unit, and the abolishment of religion. Individual economic and other freedoms are severely curtailed and overridden by the power of the state. The terms socialism and communism are often used interchangeably. This quote will help further discussion by delving into what is not socialism. I know that some people in the United States associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. So just whose words are these? Rush Limbaugh? Governor Scott Walker? Daniel DiMartini? No, these words were delivered by Lars Rasmussen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, speaking at Harvard University just a few years ago. Prime Minister Rasmussen is indeed correct. Denmark is not a socialist country, nor are the rest of the socialist Scandinavian countries, as the following table demonstrates. The Index of Economic Freedom has been published annually by the Heritage Foundation for over 28 years. The 2020 version of this index has recently been released. The index is a composite score based on 12 measures of economic freedom, covering 177 countries. The higher the score, the higher the level of economic freedom within that country. Singapore ranks number 1 in the 2022 index. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, ranks 15th. Our close ally, the United Kingdom, ranks 24th. The United States is ranked 25th in the 2022 index, 10 slots below Canada and 1 slot below the United Kingdom. Socialist countries, in red, are all ranked very low in the index, reflecting their much lower levels of economic freedom and their much higher levels of authoritarianism. Contrary to Prime Minister Rasmussen's learned opinion, Bernie Sanders and AOC want you to believe that Scandinavian countries are socialist countries, and they want the United States to emulate them. So let's see where the Scandinavian countries fall in the index. Scandinavian countries in light blue all rank quite high in the index, from 9th to 14th in the rankings, and every single one of them has a higher economic freedom ranking than that of the United States. Cato Institute's broader index of overall human freedom mirrors this finding. So, when Senator Sanders speaks of wanting the United States to be more like Scandinavia, in reality, and unbeknownst to him, he sounds more like Ted Cruz than Bernie Sanders. These indices in Prime Minister Rasmussen's quote show that Scandinavian countries are not remotely close to being socialist countries, despite what Bernie Sanders wants you to believe. Early in the 20th century, Marxist ideologues began their crusade to impose communism on the world. To do so, they took over countries and imposed the meat grinder ideology of socialism on them to forcibly wring out class differences in their quest for the utopian ideal of communism. This brutal, totalitarian campaign resulted in the deaths of millions of people. These are the victims of socialism, and now I'm going to tell you their tragic story. To begin, I'm going to read excerpts from an article titled, "Can There Be an After Socialism?" written in 2003 by Alan Charles Coors, professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. Coors wrote, "No cause ever in the history of all mankind has produced more cold-blooded tyrants, more slaughtered innocents, and more orphans than socialism with power. It surpassed exponentially all other systems of production in turning out the dead. The bodies are all around us, and here is the problem. No one talks about them. No one honors them. No one does penance for them. No one has committed suicide for having been an apologist for those who did this to them. No one pays for them. No one is hunted down to account for them. It is exactly what Solzhenitsyn foresaw in the Gulag archipelago. No one would have to answer. No one would be looked into." Continuing with Coors, "To be moral beings, we must acknowledge these awful things appropriately and bear witness to the responsibilities of these most murderous times. Until socialism, like Nazism or fascism, confronted by the death camps and the slaughter of innocents, is confronted with its lived reality, the greatest atrocities of all recorded human life, we will not live after socialism. Again from Coors, it will not happen. The pathology of Western intellectuals has committed them to an adversarial relationship with the culture, free markets, and individual rights that has produced the greatest alleviation of suffering, the greatest liberation from want, ignorance, and superstition, and the greatest increase of bounty and opportunity in the history of all human life. This pathology allows Western intellectuals to step around the Everest bodies of the victims of communism without a tear, a scruple, a regret, an act of contrition, or a reevaluation of self, soul, and mind. Today we're going to tear the veneer off of the intellectual self-serving pathology and shine a bright light on the reality of the terror, death, and destruction inflicted on the world by the perpetrators of this hideous ideology. Again from Coors, in his brilliant essay, we are surrounded by slain innocents, and the scale is wholly new. This is not the thousands killed in the Inquisition. It is not the thousands of American lynching. This is not the 6 million dead from Nazi extermination. The best scholarship yields numbers that the mind must try to comprehend. Scores and scores and scores and scores of millions of bodies. The pictures you will see today are disturbing. Horrific as they may be, they are accurate images of the agonizing pain, suffering, and death inflicted upon these innocent victims of socialism. Sadly, there were literally thousands of pictures to pick from in compiling this presentation. Beyond the visceral horror conveyed in this small sample of imagery, this presentation will attempt to put into perspective the sheer, staggering number of deaths caused by socialism. Churchill said, "Socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery." Churchill was right. Soviet socialism, based on the collectivist philosophies espoused by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, took hold in Russia after the October Revolution in 1917. Led by Vladimir Lenin, a vicious and ruthless ideologue, the victorious Bolsheviks set forth to fundamentally change Russia based upon Marx's utopian vision of society. Lenin and his fellow socialists nationalized industries and confiscated private land and other property from its owners. Religion was officially eliminated from Russian society, as Russians were forced at gunpoint to worship the power of the state. In order to firmly establish his new ideology, Lenin resorted to a campaign of mass murder of his political opponents in a purge now referred to as the Red Terror. It is estimated that upward of 1.5 million people were murdered in this brutal campaign. Lenin personally sent the orders to introduce terror and kill those who resisted the socialist takeover of Russia. This telegram is an example. Comrades, the Kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. You must make example of these people. 1, hang publicly so that people see it. At least 100 kulaks, rich bastards and known bloodsuckers. 2, publish their names. 3, seize all of their grain. 4, single out the hostages per my instructions in yesterday's telegram. Do all this so that for miles around, people see it all, understand it, tremble, and tell themselves that we are killing the bloodthirsty kulaks and that we will continue to do so. Yours, Lenin. As vicious as Lenin was, his successor as Secretary General, Joseph Stalin, was even worse. In 1929, Stalin ordered the forced removal of minor landowners and better-off peasants, the kulaks, from their farms, while simultaneously ordering the collectivization of Soviet agriculture. Under dekulakization, millions of kulaks were executed or shipped off to re-education camps in the Arctic. Under collectivization, Stalin's socialist government confiscated all private farms and livestock. Surviving peasants were forced to work on collective farms run under strict government controls. These two brutal measures resulted in millions of deaths, particularly among the deported kulaks. Soviet collectivization and dekulakization efforts were met with great resistance in Ukraine, a vast area populated by 40 million people, situated between Moscow and the Black Sea. As a result of this resistance, the Ukrainian people became the target of Stalin's wrath. In 1932, Stalin imposed impossibly high grain quotas on Ukrainian collective farms and ordered the removal of every handful of food from the region. Secret police were ordered to arrest any peasant caught stealing even the smallest amount of food. Military blockades were erected to prevent food from entering the area and to prevent the hungry Ukrainians from leaving. Predictably, and as was intended by Stalin, these measures led to a horrific famine. Entire villages were wiped out, and in some wider regions the death rate exceeded 1/3. The Ukrainian countryside, home to some of the most fertile land on earth, was reduced to a silent wasteland. Somewhere between 5 and 10 million innocent Ukrainians starved to death in a famine now referred to as the Holodomor. Socialism's propensity to induce episodes of mass starvation will be a recurring theme in this presentation. From 1936 to 38, in an attempt to consolidate and strengthen his power, Stalin conducted the Great Purge, also known as the Great Terror. Unlike the previous socialist mass murders carried out in the countryside, the Great Purge was primarily directed at Communist Party members, government officials, and Red Army leadership. In this reign of terror, hundreds of thousands of victims were accused of various political crimes, including espionage, sabotage, anti-Soviet agitation, and conspiracies to conduct coups. Those accused were either summarily executed by shooting or sent to the labor camps. According to declassified Soviet archives, during 1937 and 1938 alone, the Soviet secret police detained over 1.5 million people, of whom almost 700,000 were shot. Western scholars estimate that the actual number murdered was nearly twice this number. Stalin also presided over the vast expansion of the Soviet Gulag system, the infamous forced labor and re-education camps run by the socialist regime. The Gulag had a total inmate population of about 100,000 in the late 1920s, when it underwent an enormous expansion, coinciding with Stalin's collectivization of agriculture. By 1936, the Gulag held roughly 5 million prisoners, a number that was probably equaled or exceeded every subsequent year until Stalin died in 1953. Political prisoners consisted of rich or resistant peasants arrested during collectivization, purged Communist Party members and military officers, suspected saboteurs and traitors, and dissident intellectuals. Prisoners entered the Gulag in 3 major ways: in 1929 to 32, the years of the collectivization of Soviet agriculture; in 1936 to 38, at the height of the Great Purge; and in the years immediately following World War II. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, perhaps the Gulag's most famous inmate, claimed that between 1928 and 1953, some 40 to 50 million people served long sentences in the archipelago. Figures supposedly compiled by the Gulag administration itself, released by Soviet historians in 1989, revealed that a total of 10 million people were sent to the camps from 1934 to 1947. Gulag prisoners lived under the threat of starvation or execution if they refused to work. It is estimated that as a result of long working hours, harsh climatic and working conditions, inadequate food, and summary executions, at least 10% of the Gulag's total prisoner population died each year. Given the gory mathematics, Western scholars have estimated that the number of deaths attributed to the Gulag runs well into the millions. Solzhenitsyn wrote, "Socialism of any type leads to a total destruction of the human spirit and to a leveling of mankind into death." The Black Book of Communism, the authoritative reference source for the deadly statistics of communism, conservatively estimates that Soviet socialism led to the deaths of 20 million human beings. To put this in perspective, 20 million is roughly the entire current population of the state of New York. The magnitude of horror, death, and destruction brought about by Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin as they ruthlessly imposed socialism upon Russia and the Soviet Union is beyond human comprehension. As bad as the Russian people suffered under these two monsters, the Chinese people's descent into the hell of socialism was far worse. Mao Zedong was the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century. In 1949, as chairman of the Communist Party of China, he proclaimed the foundation of the People's Republic of China. He then set forth to impose his version on socialism, of Marxism, on the Chinese people. The results were catastrophic. Mao employed a familiar playbook in imposing socialism in China. The Great Leap Forward, launched by Mao in 1957, brought with it the forced collectivization of China's agricultural sector in an attempt to accelerate the growth of the country's industrial sector. Not surprisingly, the expropriation of private farms and with it the elimination of economic incentives to produce food led to famine and mass starvation. It is estimated that deaths from hunger alone reach more than 50% in some Chinese villages, and ultimately 30 million to 40 million Chinese peasants perished, a number roughly equal to the entire current population of the state of California. In 1968, the year before the United States first put a man on the moon, a young Chinese Red Guard who was being pursued in the countryside by the authorities took refuge in a village in Anhui, where he heard many stories about the Great Leap Forward. He later wrote, "We walked along beside the village. The rays of the sun shone on the jade-green weeds that had sprung up between the earth walls, accentuating the contrast with the rice fields all around and adding to the desolation of the landscape. Before my eyes, among the weeds, rose up one of the scenes I had been told about, one of the banquets in which the families swapped children in order to eat them. I could see the worried faces of the families as they chewed the flesh of other people's children. The children who were chasing butterflies in a nearby field seemed to be the reincarnation of the children devoured by their parents. I felt sorry for the children, but not as sorry as I felt for their parents. What had made them swallow that human flesh amidst the tears and grief of other parents, flesh that they would never have imagined tasting, even in their worst nightmares? In that moment, I understood what a butcher he had been, the man whose like humanity has not seen in several centuries, and China not in several thousand years. Mao Zedong. In the mid-1960s, Mao came to the conclusion that current Chinese socialist leadership was moving too far in a revisionist, less ideologically pure direction. In response, in August 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. Schools were shut down, and Mao called for a massive youth movement to act against Communist Party leaders for their embrace of bourgeois values and lack of revolutionary zeal. Soon, student paramilitary groups called the Red Guards were formed, and they attacked and harassed members of China's elderly and intellectual population. How ironic it is that the intellectual class was the target of Mao's bloodthirsty student brigades. Professors had their faces smeared with ink, were forced to get down on all fours and bark like dogs. Many were beaten to death, and some were eaten after being murdered. Mao, the so-called great helmsman, reveled in the bloodletting, boasting what's so unusual about Emperor Shi Huang of the China dynasty. He had buried alive 460 scholars only, but we have buried alive 46,000 scholars. No microaggressor was he. Roughly 1.5 million souls were exterminated during the Cultural Revolution. Mao also established the Logai, a vast system of forced labor and re-education camps. Over 1,000 camps were established, and it is estimated that roughly 50 million people passed through these camps through the mid-1980s, with upwards of 80% of these being political prisoners. It is estimated that 20 million captives died while being imprisoned in this Chinese version of the Gulag. The Black Book of Communism estimates that Chinese socialism led to the deaths of 65 million people. That's the equivalent of the combined populations of California and Texas, our nation's two most populous states. Think about that. Everyone living in Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, Houston, Dallas, plus so many, many more dead. Perhaps no other country suffered more at the hands of its socialist mass than Cambodia. Pol Pot's murderous Khmer Rouge seized control of Cambodia in 1975, and they then set about to impose socialism on the Cambodian people. The country suffered horribly under the socialist brutal oppression until Pol Pot was ousted in 1979. Highly xenophobic, Pol Pot set about to completely isolate the country from outside influences and to establish a collectivist, radically agrarian society. To accomplish this, their regime closed all of the country's schools, hospitals, banks, and factories. Religion was outlawed, and all private property confiscated. Most citizens in urban areas were forcibly relocated from their homes to work on collective farms. The Khmer Rouge told these residents they would be moved only a short distance from home and that they would return after only a few days. People who refused to evacuate were killed on the spot and their homes burned to the ground. The evacuees were instead sent on long marches to the collectives, during which tens of thousands of children, the elderly, and the sick died. Inevitably, the elimination of private economic incentives to grow food, coupled with government corruption and inefficiency, led to a horrific famine. Although deaths from starvation were widespread, acts such as picking wild fruit or berries was seen as private enterprise by the Khmer Rouge and were punishable by death. Commercial fishing was banned, resulting in a loss of a primary food source for millions of Cambodians, 80% of whom relied on fish as their only source of animal protein. To make way for Pol Pot's vision of an agrarian utopia, money was abolished, books were burned, and most of the country's teachers, merchants, and intellectual elite were murdered, as they were viewed to be potential enemies of the state. One need only be seen wearing eyeglasses to be branded as an intellectual and shot. Of course, in congruence with standard socialist protocol, all religion was banned. Anyone seen taking part in religious activities or services was summarily executed. Thousands of Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians were murdered simply for exercising their religious beliefs. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and his Khmer Rouge brigades took power in Cambodia in order to create an agrarian communist utopia. Inevitably and tragically, the experiment ended just like every other experiment in socialism, a dreadful, deadly disaster. The Black Book of Communism estimates that Cambodian socialism led to the deaths of 2 million people, or roughly 25% of the country's population. That's roughly the entire current population of Chicago, Illinois. Today we have seen vivid images of the horror, destruction, and death inflicted in the 20th century by 3 socialist regimes. Sadly, many more experiments with this grotesque ideology dot the historical timeline of the 20th century, each, without fail, resulting in the same hideous result. We have been presented with numerical comparisons set forth to highlight the sheer magnitude of the number of people killed by these regimes. By any measure or comparison, the toll is absolutely staggering. To deny this, or to invoke the argument of capitalism's moral equivalence to socialism, is to engage in abject intellectual dishonesty. But there is one additional facet of this human tragedy that cannot go unmentioned, one that is infinitely more difficult to see or to quantify. This being the realization and recognition of the personal fear, horror, agony, and pain experienced by each of the millions of human souls vaporized by this ghastly ideology in the 20th century. Real blinking human eyeballs once filled the empty eye sockets of the dried out skulls, now stacked like cordwood, are the victims of the Khmer Rouge. These eyes belong to real people, human souls with special talents, loves, dreams, and aspirations. They belong to mothers, fathers, sisters and brothers, sons and daughters, human beings just like all of us gathered here today. Just imagine the horror and sadness witnessed by these eyes. Just imagine the tears shed from them over a beloved child dying from starvation in his mother's arms. A friend being shot simply because she wore eyeglasses. An infant slammed to death against a tree in front of his agonized parents. And for what? To sustain an ideology that runs completely counter to human nature. An ideology that totally extinguishes human freedom and dignity and replaces it with forced allegiance to a totalitarian, all-powerful state. An ideology that, in the name of radical egalitarianism, brutally crushes any semblance of individual initiative or creativity. An ideology that must build walls to keep those subjected to it from fleeing. An ideology whose adherents believe that the end justifies the means, no matter how horrible both of these are. Make no mistake about it. The millions of deaths caused by these 3 socialist regimes were no accident, nor were they an unfortunate or unintended consequence of forced seismic changes in political and economic systems. Communism's goal of achieving a utopian society with absolute and forced equality for all is at such odds with human nature that it required the imposition of brutal and total control by the state over every aspect of the lives of those subjected to it. Those who resisted, those who desired meritocracy, and those who dared to seek freedom had to be liquidated. How do we know this? How can we be so certain? Because the architects of this evil ideology told us exactly what they intended to do. Lenin said, "Surely do not imagine that we shall be victorious without applying the most cruel revolutionary terror." Stalin said, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." Mao said, "We are prepared to sacrifice 300 million Chinese for the victory of the world revolution." Pol Pot said, "He who protests is an enemy. He who opposes is a corpse." Fortunately, there were leaders in the West who recognized the moral rot underpinning socialism and who fought back. President Ronald Reagan, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II each understood the monstrous nature of socialism. In one of the great triumphs of the 20th century, they worked together in the 1980s to undermine and defeat the Soviet Union's evil empire without firing a shot. In 1989, the Berlin Wall ceased being a barrier between communist East Berlin and free West Berlin. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved and socialism in Eastern Europe collapsed. The free world rejoiced as nearly 1 billion people were free from the shackles imposed by this repugnant ideology. Sadly, roughly 1.5 billion people in the world still live under oppressive socialist regimes in China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, and now, happening before our eyes, in Venezuela. One need not bother waiting for the tenured professors of Marxist studies teaching in America's colleges and universities to lecture about the fundamental, inherent evils of socialism. Such critical thinking will not be forthcoming. As Professor Kors noted, their pathology allows them to step around the Everest bodies of the victims of social communism without a tear, a scruple, a regret, an act of contrition, or a reevaluation of self, soul, or mind. Rather, the true story of socialism is understood and told best by other victims not mentioned so far today. For you see, not all the victims of socialism perished in the killing fields of Cambodia. Not all are buried beneath the Siberian tundra, dragged lifeless there from a hellish gulag. Not all lie in mass graves dotting the Chinese countryside and in Eastern Europe. The other victims of socialism are those who survive this wicked system, those who risk their lives and the lives of their loved ones to escape their socialist oppressors. Escapees from Cuba, boat people from Southeast Asia, former residents of Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, 7 million refugees fleeing Venezuela's ghastly experiment in socialism, people who have actually experienced and utterly rejected the horrific, soul-crushing ideology of radical egalitarianism. Listen to them. Listen to their personal stories of socialist oppression. Take in the far-off looks in their eyes as they speak of the loved ones lost or left behind during their desperate and dangerous flights to freedom. Listen to their profound gratitude for and appreciation of the freedoms that most Americans take entirely for granted. Listen to these survivors, for only they can truly speak for the 94 million human souls sacrificed on the bloody altar of socialism in the 20th century. To the people attending this lecture, the events of the 20th century chronicled in this presentation may seem to be ancient history and too far removed, both chronologically and ideologically, to be relevant to today's America. Do not be lulled into this complacency. Socialism is alive and well, both in the United States and nearby. Its destructive force has recently been unleashed on a previously prosperous nation located only about 1,500 miles southeast of Miami. In the 1990s, young Venezuelans may have felt complacent about the prospect of socialism impacting their country, but they then personally witnessed the rise of Hugo Chavez and his brand of socialism, the implementation of which led to Venezuela experiencing the biggest economic collapse in modern history outside of war or state collapse. Since 2013, Venezuela's GDP has declined by 50%, a decline double that suffered by the United States during the Great Depression. As a result, over 7 million Venezuelans voted with their feet and fled the country, a number representing over 20% of the country's population. Venezuela's path to socialism serves as a stark example of what could happen in the United States. Unlike Russia, China, and Cambodia, any transition of the United States to socialism will likely not come as a result of a sudden, violent overthrow of our government. Rather, socialism will prevail here when an uninformed, complacent, and educationally indoctrinated electorate gradually elects socialist politicians who will shred the bedrock constitutional principles currently in place to protect our freedoms. Recent examples of the gradual permeation of socialist principles into America abound. We see an educational establishment steeped in the socialist worldviews of John Dewey, Howard Zinn, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, spewing out millions of misinformed and America-hating social justice warriors from our schools. We've seen preening, woke business executives directing millions of dollars of contributions to Marxist-inspired Black Lives Matter, ignorant of the revolutionary and violent nature of the organization. We see the pushing of the Green New Deal, a vast expansion of government control to achieve forced economic equality at the cost of individual freedoms, fueled by hyperbolic climate claims. We see governments too quick to implement unconstitutional and authoritarian directives in response to the COVID pandemic. So what can you do, as young people, to push back against this progressive indoctrination? When your friend tells you that the United States is a racist, oppressive nation, ask him to explain why it is then that caravans of migrants from Central America always make the long trek north to racist, oppressive America instead of making the relatively short march southeast to socialist, utopian Venezuela. When you hear a relative claim that capitalism breeds unhealthy levels of economic inequality, mention that this freedom-fueled inequality is a far more righteous outcome than the lethal equality suffered by almost 100 million people under socialism in the 20th century. And while those atrocities were taking place, capitalist countries were achieving the highest standard of living in the history of the world. When a professor tells you that socialism is simply fire departments, post offices, and libraries, ask her how it is then that the implementation of these things could have possibly led to the deaths of almost 100 million people in the 20th century. When you hear someone extolling the virtue of Cuba's healthcare system, remind them that no one in history has tried to sit on an inner tube and float from Key West to Havana, while hundreds have perished attempting to float the opposite way to freedom. When someone tells you that the rich don't pay their fair share of taxes, point out to them that the top 3% of taxpayers in the United States pay over 50% of the nation's income tax bill, and that the United States is one of the most progressive tax systems in the world. When you were told that socialism is a great idea in theory, respond that no, socialism is a terrible idea in theory, a horrible concept made much, much worse when actually implemented. Above all, remember this as you enter the fray. As a conservative, you are on the right side of history and on the moral side of righteousness, and that the facts will always bear this out. Ronald Reagan warned against the authoritarian forces intent on subverting American freedoms when he addressed the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce in March 1961, when he said this: "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day, we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free." Reagan's words are as accurate today as they were 50 years ago, as the storm clouds of socialism and its inherent authoritarianism currently gather over our great country. In his famous speech in support of Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential candidacy, Reagan said this: "We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness." Ladies and gentlemen, we must stand full square against the socialist forces that are intent on eroding the freedoms we have enjoyed for almost 250 years. To fail in this quest will indeed sentence our exceptional country to the same darkness that befell those enslaved by their socialist masters over the course of the past 100 years. Before taking questions, I'd like to ask that we observe a moment of silence in memory of the millions of victims of socialism, past and present. At this time, I'd be delighted to respond to any questions you might have.
A question for Mr. Harbison. Please raise your hand and remember to state your name and where you go to school.
Be nice.
My name is Sarah. I'm from Buchanan High School, and my question is, the squad of, AOC and her little socialist buddies uses social media as a very effective weapon against young people like us. So how do we counter using that same weapon of social media and others when they say that things like socialism are great?
That's a good question. I'm not a big social media guy. I got too much gray hair. But, fighting back outside of the realm of social media is important. Within, again, I can't comment on within, but fighting back, bringing people to your schools to speak, like Daniel, like Grace, and others who have actually experienced socialism is very, very powerful. And so, that's what I would suggest, and continue to fight the good fight, and don't give up, and don't kowtow. Don't fade into the shadows. Come out and push your ideals and your values.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Leighton Spollinger. I go to Dos Pueblos High School here in Santa Barbara. And how would you suggest we fight socialism if our schools keep denying and not allowing us to, advocate for what we believe in and share what it is
Yeah,
about? Good.
good question. And you can form a YAF chapter at your school. You have. Okay, good. And bring speakers in. Again, like these great speakers we have here, and Jake Jacobs and Grace and Daniel, bring them in and be forceful and utilize the resources of YAF if people step in your way. So we heard last night about Clovis High School, right? And I'm sorry, thank you. And how they pushed back. That was Clovis Community College. And so, again, be out there, don't hide in the shadows, and focus on bringing in the resources available through YAF and other conservative anti-socialist organizations.
I have a question, George. So I remember just a few years ago, it was, there was only one member of Congress who was identified as a socialist, and that was obviously Bernie Sanders. And then in recent years, the squad's been elected, and it seems like the left is just drifting farther and farther left towards socialism. Why do you think that is, and do you think it says something about where we're at in society?
Yeah, I think I dwelled on that a little bit in the presentation, is that the educational system for decades has been carrying the torch for the left. And these are primarily in the public schools. And more people are either being told the wrong thing or taught nothing about the history that you saw today. Can I ask how many of you saw some of this stuff for the first time? Okay, about half. Yeah, and I think that's and I said a complacent and educationally indoctrinated, and I think it's the education system that is, and on top of that, Hollywood and mainstream media. And so, it's a tough, formidable foe, but I think that's the answer to your question.
This will be the last question.
Okay?
Hello, my name is Ellie Dana, and I'm a student at Mother Divine Grace High School. What would be your first step forward to fix the education system?
School choice. Primarily privatize the system as much as possible and take on the teachers' unions. I think if those two things could happen right away, we'd be much better off very quickly.
Sigrid Weidenweber remembers the horrific aftermath of fascism. At the end of the war, she found herself living under communism. Both of these totalitarian regimes left indelible marks on her psyche. She developed a healthy distrust of governments usurping too many powers in order to control people supposedly for their own good. After the Berlin Wall was built, she managed to escape the repressive environment with the help of friends. She holds degrees in medical technology, psychology, and an honorary Doctor of Letters for her trilogy, The Volga Flows Forever. She is the grandmother of 2 great boys with whom she hikes and swims. She lectures on anthropological and historical subjects and actively supports the arts. For the symphony, she raised funds with a monologue as Catherine the Great. At present, she is writing a memoir of her childhood during World War II and her youth spent under the German communistic regimes. She also wrote this book that you all received today called A Harsh Wind. Sigrid is also a generous supporter of Young America's Foundation and actually the lead sponsor of this program, so please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Good morning, young dear friends of America. I have the privilege to address you this morning, and I have chosen to remark on the evils of communism. We live in trying times, and what I have to say is of grave import. There go the glasses. I will begin with Ronald Reagan's famous words about the Soviet Union. No better words could have been found than to declare the Soviet Union the evil empire. President Reagan had clarity and discernment, and he understood the power of words. And Russia was evil in Reagan's time, as it is now. I want to expound a little bit more on the connotation of evil. It is a biblical word that more than any other word describes the polarity between heaven and earth, between good and evil. Evil connotes the willfully applied doing of what is determined to be wrong in every moral society. Its synonyms are foul, corrupt, ungodly, unholy, wicked, degenerate, and on and on. So why, you might ask, am I putting such emphasis on this one word? Because as a nation, we are standing on the precipice above a chasm so deep that it can swallow America whole. I, among many in this country, am worried that one more election, won or stolen, can be the step into this abyss, making America like the rest of Europe and the world. From the reports I received from Germany, France, and other European countries, one can deduct that Europe is already engendered in the Marxist communist philosophy and its controls and restrictions. If America falls into the dictates of the left, the last bastion of freedom, the shining beacon of goodness, and the best expression of humanity will be no more. As one of many Catholics who who lived under communism. We never associated Marxist communism with evil. Our churches were reviled and closed. God and the devil did not exist anymore. And Marxist communism was just a philosophy, supposed to benefit the poor and the downtrodden. But here is the nexus between God and Lucifer. According to Marx, the abolition of religion is necessary so people can become their own God. But more to the point, the Communist Party can become their God. And so began the reign of evil for us in communist East Germany. 1/3 of our population was coerced or bribed to report on the rest of the population. This broke the trust between all people and raised paranoia in every individual. Those who resisted were and are in communist countries still imprisoned and are savagely tortured by communists whose religion is the party. They justify their horrifying, monstrous behavior by stating that, in the end always justifies the means, that a dead man is better than an anti-communist man. Families were then and are now torn apart and used against each other in communist countries. Force was then and is now used to wrench possessions from the hands of those who worked and earned to be handed to those who spent and idled. Worst of all, communist devils whispered into young ears, as a time when I lived there into mine too, if you report your mother's and your father's words to me, I will reward you with the job that you wanted, the promotion you seek, or a home of your own. If that is not evil, I do not know what evil is. Then I came to America. Soon after basking in the amazing freedom, I found, though, that in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, LA, and other cities, they harbored sizable communist communities. I became very worried and let my thoughts be known. However, my concerns were laughed away by friends and acquaintances. They stated that these were just small groups of malcontents that could be kept contained by means of a system of checks and balances. I knew better, for under communism, we children had to collect money among each other, 10 cents, 50 cents, to support the communist cells set up in all foreign countries by Stalin. Also, I remembered that no one during the German Weimar Republic, no one could have imagined that a demagogue like Hitler could rise to power, and yet he did. Then I noted that America was slowly split into two divided camps. The reasons for these changes were many. It began insidiously, slowly, with the elimination of titles and achievements. Because to make everyone equal, the progressives needed to destroy the very fabric that makes people unique and exceptional in their own right. Once you called everyone by their first name only, the person's special role in society as father, mother, wife, doctor, nurse, framer, farmer disappeared. That did not always totally work, but it had enough weight to blunt a lot of achievement. The sexual revolution, with all its diversity and the push to equalize all sexual behaviors as the norm, together with the creation of a culture of drug dependency and immorality, created more divisions, isolating whole factions of society. The hallmark of socialist communism is destruction, and so the destruction of the family was next in order. We have all seen the bowdlerized families on TV. Silly, a concoction of improbable characters thrown together in a happy muddle of hilarity. This step was followed with the indoctrination of young minds about their gender, about right and wrong. And of course, churches were destroyed, mostly from the inside out. For a person who believes in God and the deity's tenets cannot be successfully indoctrinated. The discerning, questioning ones among us began to notice that agitators, sometimes foreigners, began telling us that we were all children of one God and that therefore we were responsible for our brothers in all the world and needed to take them all into our care. In the last 30 years, I saw 8 churches destroyed through internal division, and this was just in my immediate area, because all these issues, among others, lead to a bifurcated cultural reality and are the reasons for the ever-growing divide in our country. Lastly, anyone who speaks out or is standing up against woke progressive ideology is viciously pursued in and outside the law. The causes enumerated here with the onslaught of the never-ending diatribe of progressive voices are about the destruction of anything philosophical and cultural that makes our nation great and exceptional. I mourn the disappearance of what we once called common sense. Our culture has devolved to the point where ordinary people suffer from anxiety when they have to make simple, sensible choices. Well, however, that was my past, about which you can read in my book, A Harsh Wind, that the Foundation has so nicely provided you. Then, today our concerns are much more alarming. For then, the communists spied on us through people. Their reports were minuscule compared to the data one search on the internet can yield today. Since the times of Hammurabi, you probably know the 6th Amorite king of Babylonia, we have fairly good records of biblical power brokers. Caesars, czars, potentates, politicos, and power seekers by any other name. Men of this kind, many certifiable psychopaths, have been within humanity forever. However, they never had the power and the means to enslave the entire globe and control all of humanity. Until today. With the internet and all other wonders of our technological advances, they give power-hungry elites the means to turn humanity into robotic slaves, performing at the whims of their overseers. I spent my first 20 years of life under the control of the communist East German government. The communists had full control over all aspects of my life, daily, at home and at large. I had to perform to their wishes, learn what they wanted me to learn, wear the clothes they produced in their horrible factories, and I ate the simple foods that they made in other simple factories. At high school graduation, they determined that I could not become a doctor, as I had wanted and applied for to university, for they wanted teachers, and so they chose a university for me that they thought competent, complete with the subjects I was to study. It was terrible then, but what I see in China today is a totally new form of communism. It not only controls daily life, but goes into the minutiae of our privacy and the body. In China, the harvesting of organs from political adversaries is already a known fact. The COVID pandemic gave multiple governments the power to enclose us in our homes, close our schools and businesses, and force inoculations on people, wanted or not. There is talk emanating from the World Health Organization, which is controlled by China, of course, that we should have chips implanted in our bodies containing records of all our health data. Yes, health data, and what else? I can see in your eyes that most of you are well aware of these political measures already implemented or planned for the future. I believe that the worldwide COVID control was an exercise, a harbinger of total control for people's minds and bodies. Furthermore, we see the beginnings of an electronic surveillance network. Already people begin to voice distrust in governmental websites and organizations. They also begin to choose carefully in whom to confide political thought. That fact alone reminds me strongly of how I lived under communism. The power elites like the George Soros, Tamiko Boltons, the Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Priscilla Chen, Melinda Gates, Paul Allen, Steve Ballmer, and many, many more, you may know all these names. They're all billionaires and allies of the European, Russian, and Chinese elites. They would like to have control over the globe at large. Why? They are already rich and powerful. Well, that's just it. Dominion over the globe would be the final grab and control over billions of slaves. They stated their goals quite openly. Most of them believe that this planet is overpopulated and humanity must be reduced. Of course, one asks, who is to live and who is to die and who decides? And then there is the Great Reset. The Great Reset. In 2020, members of the world elites, to which the aforementioned Americans belong, met at the World Economic Forum and launched the Great Reset initiative to transform the world's economy. Klaus Schwab, director and founder of this forum, a horrible German man, as you would know if you had ever heard him speak, he would, with the help of America's elites, change capitalism and the American way of life forever. The Great Reset would give us a cashless society and environmental justice. Well, we know what that means. It entails the redistribution of America's and Europe's wealth and money. Of course, China is on the forefront of this woke experiment, and therefore I strongly urge you, go to the Hillsdale College website and read the Imprimis series about the Great Reset. It is wonderful, and I don't have enough time in my allotted minutes to expound on the topic. It seems that most of the world is at war with the last entity standing between these Illuminati and freedom of the globe. It is the American Republic with its Constitution. And as a free and vocal opposition, we, you in particular, will be a part of the bulwark that stands firm and prevents the forces of evil to complete their objectives. Here's a quote from my book, My Life in Freedom. Freedom only thrives in a citizenry willing to assume the responsibility to live according to the laws preserving freedom. Once the belief in a deity is erased from the conscience of a nation, the laws of man become the measure of law and order. It was predictable, therefore, that henceforth man's law could be stretched to suit political factions, as one stretches a rubber band. Well, I wish the US Department of Justice would know these tenets and would adhere to them. With that thought, I send you out into the world to stand firm for what is good, right, and free in our country. And I thank you for your attention. I will now answer any questions you might have.
Students, if you would like to ask Sigrid a question, please raise your hand and tell us your name and school.
Hello, my name is Brandon Kelly, and I attend Trinity Christian in Monterey, California. And my question was, in the beginning you mentioned how you were a Catholic. Now, was there any time while living in communist Germany that you felt closer or further away from Christ?
Well, you know, I have to answer that in a roundabout way, because all of us who had religious thoughts and affiliation, our affiliation depended, and our thoughts about Christ depended on how our family held us at home. And it was our fathers and mothers who really were the ones that kept us connected to Catholicism and to the Bible and what is right and wrong. And I can tell you, even so, there wasn't much going to church anymore because our churches were deprived of any means of money. The communists had a really great way of choking off all funds that kept churches alive. And so our churches were falling apart. And sometimes the buildings were so bad that you couldn't even go in anymore without stones falling upon you. So you sort of wandered away from the community, but what was with you, the tenets, they were always with you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm from Buchanan High School, and my question is, you said that you had to collect money to send to communist cells in other countries. Can you name a few of the countries that you had to send money to, and if they have a strong socialist presence or not currently?
Okay, well, America was one country, and we send money to San Salvador, we send money to practically every country in South America because of their cultural and social vulnerability. They were ripe targets for communism. So we send money all over there. We also send money to Africa because the same thing happened in Africa. It was all over a very, very poor continent, and you could get into all of their societies there and start raising a communist faction. So all that money was collected in Germany, in Poland, in Bulgaria, Romania, all the kids who were raised behind the Iron Curtain. We all did this, had to. We also all had to learn Russian. I had 8 years of Russian, so therefore I never learned English or any other language except for Latin, which you had to. And so this money was then centrally shipped to Russia. At that time, that I remember best, it was all under Stalin and then under, I think it was Malenkov. And Russia then decided which one of these cells were the most vulnerable and allocated the greatest amount of funds to those cells because they wanted a bang for their money. Okay.
Hi, Sigrid. You mentioned that you came from East Germany, and I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about how you escaped from East Germany? What was the process like? I imagine it was the beginning of the building of the Berlin Wall, right, and the Iron Curtain. So, like, where did you escape to, you know, and how was all that? I think we're all very interested.
Well, that's a wonderful story. I can talk about that for a long time. The communists built the wall on August 13. I remember this date forever. It's my birthday. They built the wall, and they did it for a purpose because all the young students were out of Berlin. They had 1 month of vacation. The rest of their vacation time, they had to donate to the state for service, all kinds of odd jobs that the government needed done. So all students were out, including me and friends. Suddenly they built the wall. And when we wanted to return home, our funds ran out. We had to show our passports. You could never go anywhere without your passport. They controlled you everywhere. And when you went from one city to the other, you had to go to the police department and check out. And when you came back, you had to check in. So we were all on vacation, couldn't go home. And by the time they let us go into Berlin again, the border was closed, very well closed. They were very much afraid that had we been in Berlin at the time and around the border areas, we would have just marched over, and they couldn't have held all of us back. So now we came back, and the wall was up, and for about 3 months, there was a group of about 8 of us, 4 girls, 5 boys. We tried to find out ways how to still cross the border. And we did this every night for about 3 months. And I'm going to tell you all these stories. But then I got a phone call from a boy who said he wanted to have a blind date. And I said, I'm not going on a blind date. Who are you? And he was very clever. He was very persuasive, and he said, well, you know, it's just a movie in the afternoon, and if you don't like me, you don't have to stay. So I went. And he had told me to bring a newspaper under my arm so he could identify me. Well, I went to this movie theater on the border, and there wasn't anyone there that I thought would have been a date for me until someone came from the back, kissed me on the cheek, and said, act normal, you're my cousin, into my ear, very silent. I turned around, and there was a young Catholic father in the habit. I nearly dropped dead. And I said, you scared me. I could have really given the whole thing away. And he said, it's okay, go with me for a walk. And he took my arm. He said, the movie for the public, he spoke loudly, the movie's not starting, let's take a walk in the park. So he took me into the park, and he said, under my arm is the same newspaper that you have, let's switch. And in the newspaper is a French passport. I hope you speak French. And of course I didn't. So then he gave me instructions and said, you can cross the border with this passport. And there was also some money in the newspaper, probably about 3 German marks, and a return ticket. And so I asked him, how did that happen? And he said, well, someone knew you wanted to get out. You have a real good friend at the Free University in West Berlin. And they had a photo of yours, and there's your photo in this French passport. And just look where it's a passport of someone who traveled a lot. So find out what the countries are. Maybe you have to talk, maybe they make you talk. And go in a restaurant, strip your clothes of everything that looks like East German make. Because if they strip search you, they will then know that you're not French. So I did this. We switched newspapers. He had to leave. I went into the next hotel, went in a bathroom, pulled the labels out of my shoes. I pulled a label out of my coat. I fortunately had homemade clothes. My grandmother made my clothes. So my dress and everything else was okay. My underwear was stuff my best German aunts had sent me, so they had good labels. And then I gathered myself together, and by that time I was pretty shaky because they didn't make it easy. You went, the crossover for civilians was you had to go through a double post of about 8 double posts or so, and when you came in, all soldiers. And they started asking me in German, passport, and I ignored them because I couldn't respond since I was supposed to be French. So I just put on a brave smile and walked through it. And some of them even ran after me and said, passport. And I just kept on going. And then I came to the point where they wanted to see my passport, and they wanted to see if I had money. And they were particularly interested in East German money that you might take over. Well, I didn't have any. And as I stood there waiting to get in line for this examination, there came the point that probably was the hardest for me, because behind these people there were little cabins where they strip searched you. And that, to me, I really didn't want to face that. And because once they strip searched you, they knew something was wrong, and your chances of ending out in jail, and the price at that time was 10 to 15 years, or the mines, or something like this. We all knew that. And I got lucky when it was my turn to get forward to the table. The guy didn't speak French either. And I found that out because he asked for money. And so I gave him what I had, and I thought, well, we both don't speak French. This will be good. And he let me go. And the entire time I had been pretty confident. I sort of had a feeling there was someone beside me who kept me up and kept me strong. And then I started to walk up the steps to the city train that still went around between East Germany and East Berlin and West Berlin. And as I walked out the steps, that feeling of having someone beside me, it suddenly left me. And I almost didn't make it up the stairs, because suddenly it dawned on me, I was still on the wrong side. I was only half safe. Well, and this is how I got out.
We have time for one final question, and I'm actually going to ask it. Sigrid, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I'd also like to know, flash forward a few decades, to when the Berlin Wall came down. Can you tell us a little bit about what that meant to you, and also about what President Ronald Reagan meant to you when you first recognized him as an enemy of communism, and a little bit about what he meant to you?
Well, when the wall came down, I think it was 75. Was it 75? I don't even know anymore. We had been waiting for so many years, and in East Germany, we thought that whole system would have to collapse at any moment. We said that our country was held together only by chewing gum and baling wire, so we thought it should break. And then when the collapse finally came, and the collapse came through two people, well, actually, more. There started in East Germany a very, very strong rally among the faithful. Lutherans, Catholics, all the faiths got together. And without anyone having a way of pulling together a community, every Sunday the churches became larger and larger and larger. They had so many people on every Sunday service that they started to stand out in the streets and heard the sermons through loudspeakers, and they sang. They sang and sang, especially in Dresden. And that went on through the whole country. And then we had, of course, Gorbachev, and he started opening up a very, very small opening of diplomacy with the Russians. And of course, we had Ronald Reagan. And when Ronald Reagan spoke about the evil empire and stood in Berlin and held this beautiful, famous speech, then suddenly everything sort of fell into place. And Gorbachev and Reagan, they were the deciding factors, and the wall came down. And the people knew it. No one had yet officially been told that this communist empire was over, but the people somehow knew, because it was one night. They all streamed to the border with sledgehammers and all kinds of stuff and started to tear the wall down. And so I said, safe in America, and I thought it couldn't have happened, because no one thought that it would ever happen. We thought that was forever, and it was a miracle.
Thank you very much, CJ. Thank you so much. Alrighty, students, we have still a few minutes before we head into lunch, and then after that we're going to head to the ranch. So I have a couple of important instructions that I'm going to give you right now about the ranch. One, I'm going to say it again, make sure you dress warm. It looks like we're not going to have rain, which is great, but still make sure you bring a jacket, so if you need to dig that out of your bag, make sure you do that within the next hour. Also, it is about a 45-minute to an hour-long bus ride up to the ranch, so make sure you stop at the restroom before we leave. Sometimes there can be a line at the restroom, so try to, spread out over the hour of lunch so we can leave on time. We should be pulling out of here at about 12:15, so make sure you stop by the restroom, grab your jacket, head into lunch downstairs. And one other thing that I'd love to encourage you to do during lunch. You might have noticed that we actually have a piece of the Berlin Wall downstairs, right inside the front door. Now you have a little bit more history, context for that piece of the wall. Pretty incredible. We actually have a little 5-minute video that goes with it. Some of you guys watched it last night. If you have not had a chance to watch that video yet, I would definitely encourage you to do that during lunch. So make sure you stop by and make sure to clean up all your stuff out of the classroom, and then lunch will be back downstairs. Thank you.